Part 2. When the hero begins to act like a tyrant. The year was 330 BC. Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, was reduced to ash and rubble under the heels of the Macedonian army. The scent of victory, smoke, and wine still lingered in the air. The Macedonian soldiers had achieved the impossible. They thought the war was over, that after so many years of campaigning, they could finally pack up their spoils, return to their homeland, show off their scars, and tell their children tales of great battles. But they were mistaken. Their commander, Alexander, seemed to have no concept of rest. While the soldiers dreamt of the hills of Macedonia, he was gazing eastward, towards the distant, mysterious lands on the map. Alexander's mind was now obsessed with two things: a traitor named Bessus and an empire not yet fully conquered. Bessus, who had murdered his own king, Darius III, and then proclaimed himself king, was a thorn in Alexander's side. It was not just a political threat. It was an insult to the order of the world, an act that Alexander, as the legitimate successor to the Persian kings, felt a duty to punish. And so, instead of the road home, the army received new orders: continue the march east. A collective sigh of weariness went through the camp, but no one dared to disobey. The journey into the unknown began once more. Deceitful promises and punishment in Arya. The first destination was Arya, a dusty land that people today call Afghanistan. The governor there, Satybarzanes, was an old political fox. When Alexander arrived, he came out to greet him with the most servile demeanor imaginable. He prostrated himself before the king, offered precious gifts, and swore oaths of loyalty as sweet as honey. Alexander, perhaps all too used to such flattery, accepted his submission and kept him in his position. But Satybarzanes' loyalty was as thin as a layer of desert dust. The moment the heels of the main army had disappeared over the horizon, he turned his coat. He called upon the people to revolt, slaughtering the small garrison Alexander had left behind. The news reached Alexander like a lightning bolt. His anger was terrifying to behold. To be deceived, to be betrayed by a man he had spared, was something he would never accept. He immediately turned the army around, marching at a phenomenal speed. Satybarzanes, horrified by Alexander's return, hastily fled. The rebellion was brutally crushed. Soon after, word came that Satybarzanes had been killed in single combat by a Greek cavalry officer named Erigyius. It was a fitting end, a clear message to the entire East. Never trifle with Alexander. To stamp his authority on this land, he founded a new city and named it Alexandria Ariana. An outpost, a fortress, a permanent declaration that this was Macedonian territory. Darkness within the family, the case of Philotas and Parmenion. The army continued on to Phrada, and it was here that a terrible internal storm began to brew. Not from an external enemy, but from within the army's own ranks. The Macedonian court had never been a peaceful place. Plots, purges, and assassinations were part of its dark history. Alexander's own father, King Philip, had fallen to an assassin's blade from his own bodyguard. Alexander grew up in that environment, and suspicion was in his blood. Word was secretly brought to him. There was a plot to assassinate him, and it had been discovered. But the one who discovered it, Philotas, had remained silent and not reported it immediately. This was no trivial accusation. Philotas was the son of Parmenion, the most respected old general in the army. Philotas himself was the commander of the companion cavalry, the elite mounted force that had been decisive in every major battle. He was a hero, one of Alexander's closest companions. To a suspicious king like Alexander, that silence was unforgivable. Philotas was arrested. A trial was held before the entire army. The atmosphere was so tense it was suffocating. Philotas, so brave on the battlefield, proved weak in the face of accusation. Under brutal torture, he confessed to everything, even implicating others. The death sentence was carried out immediately. Philotas and those implicated were stoned to death by the soldiers. But Alexander knew that the snake had not yet been beheaded. Parmenion, Philotas's father, was in Ecbatana, in command of a large army and the imperial treasury. The old general was a living legend, beloved and respected by the soldiers. If news of his son's death reached him, a civil war was a very real possibility. Alexander acted with a cold and chilling efficiency. He dispatched his most trusted men that very night. Their order was to reach Ecbatana before the news of Philotas's execution could spread, and to kill Parmenion. It was a race against time. And they won. The great general Parmenion, 70 years old, who had dedicated his entire life to the Macedonian kingdom, was stabbed to death in his own residence by men sent by the king he served. This purge forever changed Alexander in the eyes of his soldiers. The young general, the older brother who had fought alongside them, was gone. In his place stood an absolute monarch, filled with suspicion and capable of ruthless brutality. Fear began to creep into the ranks, reaching the edge of the world. After consolidating his power through blood, Alexander resumed his eastward march. Bessus was eventually betrayed by his own subordinates and handed over to Alexander. Alexander ordered Bessus's ears and nose to be cut off, then had him sent back to Persia to suffer a painful public execution. It was a brutal political spectacle, demonstrating that he was both the successor and the avenger of the Persian kings. But the war was not over. The army entered Sogdia and Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, and met a persistent guerrilla resistance. The enemy would emerge from the mountains, attack swiftly, and then vanish. The war was long and costly, making Alexander increasingly impatient and cruel. Finally, the army reached the banks of the Jaxartes River, the natural boundary of the former Persian Empire. Across the river lay the vast steppes of the nomadic Scythians. To mark the northernmost point of his conquest, Alexander founded Alexandria Escate, Alexandria the farthest. And, to decisively end the Scythian threat, he used a stratagem to lure them into a major battle and crush them with his military might. When arrogance kills friendship. Years had passed. The soldiers were weary to their very bones. They missed their homes, their families. But Alexander's ambition seemed limitless. Worse, he was beginning to change. He wore Persian silk robes and gradually adopted Eastern court rituals, things the simple Macedonians found alien. The breaking point was reached at Mariconda. During a drunken feast, Cleitus the Black, one of the finest commanders and the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, publicly criticized the king. He said that Alexander had become arrogant and had forgotten the contributions of the Macedonians. Drunk and enraged, his pride deeply wounded, Alexander snatched a spear from a guard and, in a moment of madness, ran his friend through. As Cleitus fell, Alexander snapped back to reality. Overwhelming remorse and pain consumed him. For 3 days afterward, he locked himself in his tent, refusing food and water, drowning in his guilt. That incident was a wound that never healed. Not long after, he tried to impose the ritual of proskynesis, demanding that everyone prostrate themselves before him. For Greeks and Macedonians, that was an act reserved for the gods. The entire court and army vehemently objected. This time, Alexander had to back down. Another assassination plot was uncovered, this time orchestrated by the royal pages. The plot failed, and the conspirators were executed. The historian Calisthenes was also suspected of being involved. He was imprisoned and died shortly thereafter. Alexander was becoming increasingly isolated and fearsome. Amidst this tension, he met Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian chieftain. Her beauty captivated him. Their marriage was both a matter of love and a masterful political move, helping to reconcile with the local tribes and stabilize the region. The conquest of India and the mutiny. With his rear secured, Alexander once again looked eastward, to the mythical land of India. His greatest and final major battle took place on the banks of the Hydaspes River against King Porus. For the first time, the Macedonian army faced war elephants. These colossal beasts created a terrifying spectacle. It was an incredibly difficult and bloody victory. Alexander, though victorious, was immensely impressed by Porus's courage and allowed him to keep his kingdom. After the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander wanted to push on. He believed he was close to the edge of the world, but his soldiers did not. On the banks of the Hyphasis River, a mutiny occurred. The entire army simply stopped. They were too tired after 8 long years and refused to go any further. Alexander was shocked. He begged, he persuaded, he raged and threatened, but nothing could move them. For the first time, his will was broken by his own men. Hurt and resentful, he finally had to give the order to turn back. The journey home and the death of a king. The journey back was a nightmare. Alexander decided to lead the army on foot through the brutal Gedrosian desert. Thousands of soldiers, men who had survived countless battles, perished from the heat, thirst, and starvation. When he returned to Persia, he dealt harshly with the corrupt governors. He tried to fuse the two cultures by organizing a massive wedding ceremony. Another mutiny by the Macedonian soldiers broke out at Opis, but it was eventually resolved through an emotional speech by the king. Then the greatest tragedy struck. Hephaestion, his closest friend, died suddenly from a fever. Alexander was utterly devastated. The conqueror of the world seemed to have lost half of his own soul. He returned to Babylon. Embassies from all over the known world came to pay homage. Roxana was pregnant with his child. He was planning a new campaign, into Arabia. But fate had other plans. Alexander was suddenly struck by a violent fever. 10 days later, in June of 323 BC, at the age of 32, Alexander the Great, the undefeated king, died. The cause of his death remains an eternal mystery. It could have been disease, or it could have been poison. He departed, leaving behind a colossal empire with no successor. His generals immediately began to tear his legacy apart, initiating decades of bloody warfare. In the chaos, his wife and son were both murdered. The empire he had spent his short life building dissolved into smoke and clouds. But his legacy endured. He had carried Greek culture to the edge of the known world, ushering in a new era. And the name Alexander the Great would be forever etched into history as one of the greatest and most complex military leaders who ever lived. Thanks for watching.